divisions of the skull and skull sinuses. The skull can be split into two basic parts. The first being the cranium, or the part of the skull that houses the brain, and the second is the facial bones, or the part of the skull that does not house the brain. The cranium is made of the ethmoid, the frontal, the occipital, the sphenoid, and a paired parietal and temporal bones. So two parietal and two temporal bones. The other bones are singular. Whereas the facial bones are a group of bones on the anterior portion of the skull which do not house the brain, two inferior nasal conchae, two lacrimal bones, a mandible, two maxillae, two nasal bones, two palatine bones, which would be deep inside, a vomer, and two zygomatic bones. I'll point those paired bones out in a moment, like the nasal and the maxillary bones. The cranium can be further subdivided into cranial divisions. The first being a calvaria, or the roof, and then the cranial base. The thing that I want you to notice right away is that the cranial base is made up of portions of all of the cranium bones. So again, the cranial base is made of a portion of the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, a portion of the parietal bones, a portion of the occipital bones, and some of the temporal bones. The calvaria, or the roof, is only made of the frontal, the occipital, and the paired parietal bones. So the cranial base is going to include all the bones of the cranium, whereas the calvaria will only include select bones. So these terms are good to be able to reference. On occasion, you may hear the term calvaria as opposed to cranial base to further subdivide the cranium. Moving into the facial bones here, so just another view on what you noticed up above. Notice the paired nasal bones with a division down that mid-sagittal plane. So we have two nasal bones, two maxillary bones. We have our paired zygomatic bones, a mandible, and then deep inside, we're going to have some inferior nasal conchae. We're going to have our palatine bones, which will also make up a part of the orbit of the eye, as well as our vomer bone. So those bones, those 14 bones, 6 paired and 2 unpaired bones, make up the facial bones. A little bit of extra on a few of these facial bones. So the maxilla bones, the paired maxilla bones, are a bone that extend up quite a ways, and that is the thing that I want you to glean from this side, is that not only do they extend down and become a big portion of the anterior part of our face, but they're going to extend up all the way until they're contacting this nasal bone into that orbit of the eye, so they extend up quite a ways. Again, a bone that I wanted to just single out as an unusual one, the palatine bones. You'll see these in lab just posterior to the palatine process of the maxilla. So the palatine process of the maxilla is going to be this structure right here as part of the maxilla bones, the maxillary bones. And then the palatine bone is going to pick up and make up the posterior third of the hard palate. This palatine bone is a little bit unusually shaped because it's going to extend superiorly quite a ways and actually become part of the orbit of the eye as it comes up superior. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So now I want to just dive in and cover the sinuses. There are 4 sinuses. I'm going to pull up a different slide that I just was looking at. There's 4 sinuses in the skull: the frontal sinus, an ethmoid sinus, a maxillary sinus right on inferior to the eyes, to the orbits of the eyes, and a sphenoid sinus here in the sphenoid bone. These sinuses are all named for the bones in which they are housed, and so that makes them easy to differentiate. So the sinuses are going to be air-filled pockets inside of the face, and they are going to be mucus-lined. There is some debate about the purpose of the sinuses. So here we can see these air-filled pockets in the skull. There's some debate about the purpose of these. A few of the thoughts are that these sinuses actually increase our vocal ability. So as speech and other vocal sounds were developed, that the sinuses actually contribute to amplification of that sound. There's some thoughts that these sinuses actually just serve to lighten the skull. Our skull and our brain are already really heavy in comparison with the rest of our body. And so these sinuses may help to actually lighten the load. So there's a few thoughts on potentials as to the purposes of those sinuses. But as far as I know, it is currently unknown as to their true purpose. Another view on those sinuses where you might have some spongy bone interconnected in those sinuses, in those air-filled sacs. Again, that they're going to be porous. They're going to allow for movement of air and fluid. And anybody who has had a nice sinus headache will know exactly where those sinuses exist. Finally, a last point on those sinuses is that these sinuses actually increase in size as we age. So you'll see from this side here that when a person is young, they're going to have relatively small sinuses. This is the frontal and a sphenoidal sinus, or a maxillary sinus, which is why I paused. So at age 1, they're going to have a relatively small sinus. And then as we age, those sinuses are going to increase in size and as an ever-changing part of that bone. And that finishes this video on divisions of the skull and sinuses.